Welcome to the Roundtable. I'm here with Dr. Ashok Gangadean, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Philosophy Department at Haverford College. Dr. Gangadean was the first director of the Margaret Guest Center for the Cross-Cultural Study of Religion, and he has written widely in the area of interreligious dialogue. His works include Meditative Reason and Between Worlds, the Emergence of Global Reasoning. His current work is The Awakening of the Global Mind. Dr. Gangadean finds his own spiritual center in the interreligious experience. He grew up in Jamaica, where his family was both Hindu and Christian. He has studied Zen Buddhism, Quakerism, and Sufism, among other things. He says that he is always in a dialogical process. We introduced Dr. Gangadean to tell us about the dialogical process and why it is so important for people like us today. We turn now to Dr. Ashok Gangadean.
In these introductory remarks, I would like to try to connect two or three themes that are usually not clearly connected, that would be vital for understanding why the dialogical process and global ethics and interreligious dialogue are profoundly and inseparably connected. It's clear that we're living in a very exciting moment in history. Something profound and wonderful is happening, and this can only be seen if we can stand back and take a look and live through the spectrum of cultures and religions that have been evolving over the centuries. If we can do this and enter into alternative religious cultural worlds, something amazing begins to show itself, a deep pattern centuries in the making. It begins to appear that the different religions and cultural worlds converge on a common theme of a birth of a new level of human consciousness, a new humanity. We begin to see, as we look across religious worlds, that they are all deeply concerned with a way of being human that needs to be overcome. In one way or another, it's clear that there has been an ego-centered view of being human, and that the different religious worlds press against that to show that the essence of our being human turns upon awakening a dialogical consciousness that overcomes the ego-centered way of being human. This can be seen, for example, deep in the Judaic tradition, with the ultimate command to love God with all our heart and all our being. That injunction calls upon humans to open themselves in the deepest way, to place the divine presence first and foremost in all life. That calls for a deep recentering that is profoundly dialogical and renovates and demands that we overcome an ego-centered view, which places the ego consciousness as the center of our human reality. Clearly, if we look at the life of Jesus, the deepest concern and command to love one another and to awaken and to really go through a profound rebirth calls equally in this tradition of the Judaic ethic for a renovation of our being and a move to a dialogical consciousness. So there in the Judeo-Christian roots we find already profoundly the call for this awakening of a new awareness that centers upon God and the presence of God and the divine as the primary concern for human beings, which calls for the deepest change in our lives. So the injunction to love one another may be seen already as the essence of a dialogical principle. But really, if we look across the spectrum of cultures and look, say, into the Hindu world, clearly here too we find in a very different scenario, but yet relentlessly focusing on the same point, that the essence of our awakening has to do with overcoming ego-centered consciousness. In the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Lord Krishna takes Arjuna, who embodies the ego consciousness, on a deep transformation and awakening to enter into the higher consciousness that centers on the divine principle that really sees a profoundly interconnected reality, very different than the one shown in ego awareness. So too in the Buddhist awakening, the essence of Buddha's awakening, and even the word Buddha means awakening, it essentially turns upon seeing through the emptiness and futility of living in a world that objectifies and creates entities, especially where the self is concerned. The Buddha's Great Awakening really shows that humans are not entities or objects of any kind, and that is empty. So that the ego construction of the self that seems to take itself as a separately existing entity is profoundly wrong and wrongful, and is in fact the source of the deepest suffering. So that the themes of sin and suffering and the human condition are directly traced to our ego-centered way of being, and the deepest call of these religious visions bring us to really transform our being to a dialogical, open, interactive, unified way of being a human. So too, if we look into the Chinese origins, for example, of the Tao or of the Confucian mandate of heaven, these moral origins call us equally to awaken to a higher consciousness that can see the interrelationality of humans and the higher law as the centering principle in human life. Equally, in African traditions, the Muntu, the call of the original word, and the vital force seen, it appears from this that the scenario of the birthing of this dialogical consciousness is peaking more and more and accelerating. And yet at the same time, the counter-egocentric forces of culture are also peaking. And so something very profound and critical is happening in the culture, which makes our very survival at stake in the question of coming to a deeper awareness and practice of this dialogical moment. I'd like to now connect the question of this dialogical evolution coming through cultures, this new consciousness, with what I would call the global mentality or the global mind. Of course, when we hear the word global, we tend first to think more of physical, the globe and the geography and the different nations. And we speak of global in this context. But really, in the wider cultural sense, global means a mentality that is open to recognize the plurality of profoundly different cultures and religious worlds and views and perspectives. So in the way we speak about global, in terms of global ethics and global consciousness, is to see that the essence of global is dialogical. I'd like to stress that the dialogical is a deep change in our being. It is not simply standing where we are in our particular views and speaking it out to others and listening to others from afar. The dialogical calls for a deep risk and a deep vulnerability in our deepest being, calling upon us to open ourselves and to be willing to reconsider, in the most deep way, the worldview in which we live and all of our presumptions and assumptions that has been at the source of our way of life. So that there's something deeply risky and dangerous in truly opening oneself and challenging. The kind of risks that people in the business world, for example, entrepreneurs, who have been forced to reconsider the deepest assumptions of their business practices and business enterprise, are already in touch with this dialogical risk and entrepreneurial spirit. So that when I speak of global, I mean global in the sense of a disposition to be profoundly open to others, to other persons, to other religions, to other cultures, to other perspectives, a willingness to revise and experiment and transform in an ongoing, open-ended way, so that the global is the dialogical in practice. And we should see that it doesn't apply only in the so-called international global scene, as we're used to think of it, but in our deepest inner life, this dialogical or global outlook is at work in our personal and interpersonal relations, in our business corporation, as well as in the society, and of course on the macro level as well. So we should think of the global as the dialogical practice, the dialogical turn in awareness that requires this open outlook of willingness to listen to the other and to encounter and to enter and to overcome what one has presumed and assumed to make that turn. And what is remarkable in this global outlook and dialogical outlook is that the willingness to risk and enter into this other perspective and other perspectives always turns around to deeply enrich one's and deepen one's root in where one stands. So I'd like to connect the global mind or mentality with the dialogical or global ethics. The term global ethics is being used in many, many ways right now. But for us, the global ethics indicates this dialogical consciousness. That's the essential connection. And really, if you look at the evolution of ethics through the religious worlds, it becomes clear that the most important advances in moral consciousness through the ages, from Moses to Jesus to Buddha to Krishna to Lao Tzu, and all the way across, has been the moving to a deeper dialogical being. In other words, ethics points to the deepest way in which we conduct our life and our mind and our thinking. It is not only an external behavior, but the behavior reflects a deeper inner transformation. So the moral awakening of humanity over the past 3,000 years, for example, has been pressing to this global awakening and dialogical way of being. And this is why, for example, whether it's in the injunction to love God with all one's heart, or in Jesus' version of love one another, or Buddha's principle of dharma or compassion, to love all beings and all creatures and to tend to their suffering, we get many different formulations and different takes on what might be considered a principle of global ethics. In other words, ethics is profoundly global and universal across the spectrum of cultures and religions. It's almost a redundancy to call it global ethics. So I would like to speak of the dialogical principle, which I see as at the heart of global ethics. If, for example, we had a formulation that we are responsible for the well-being of all creatures, of all beings, and we propose that as a possible formulation of global ethics, we would naturally ask, why? Why should I be responsible for all creatures, or anyone else other than myself and my immediate family? The direction of the answer is to this dialogical consciousness and reality that's been emerging. When we realize that in our deepest being we cannot stand alone, we are not human beings in isolation, but again, in our deepest reality, we are profoundly interactive and interconnected with those around us, not only with human beings, but with all creatures, and even more so with nature and the ecology as such. We are woven together in a dialogical, interactive principle. We can call that the reality principle. So that the dialogical principle of global ethics really derives right at the very core, the pulse and evolution of the process of reality itself. So this global ethics may be formulated in many ways, and it's not something new. It's been emerging for centuries under many formulations, and we need to see the connections. So the golden rule, for example, to do unto others as you would have others do unto you, the injunction to love God, the injunction not to harm other creatures, the positive injunction to take responsibility for the well-being and care of others and the environment. These are all profoundly connected in the dialogical principle. So in our exploration of interreligious dialogue and global ethics, I hope it begins to be clear why global ethics is so profoundly connected with the project of interreligious dialogue. For the global ethics is profoundly dialogical, and the dialogical begins to emerge deeply when we see how interactions take place and have been taking place through the centuries between alternative religious worlds and cultures. So interreligious dialogue, global ethics, and dialogical consciousness are profoundly connected. I'd just like to say in conclusion that to come right to this roundtable and our objectives here, when we look at our culture on the present scene, I said at the beginning of my remarks that we're in a very exciting moment in history, on the threshold of a new century and a new millennium, and some of us think of a new consciousness, a new age, a new stage of human evolution. But we should also stress the great risks and dangers that we face at this moment. That's why it's so critical. If we look at our culture in the American scene, for example, we can see the evidence, the devastating evidence of egological culture at work in the profound ways of violence on all levels as humans abuse themselves and each other through their addictions and their failures of relationships and the breakdown of values and the collisions of ideologies and the violence that erupts. On every level, we see the evidence of the egocentric culture, which always leads to separations, divisions, violence of all forms. And so what's at stake is our very survival. And it's in this spirit that we are holding these roundtables and coming together to try and join forces, because we believe that this awakening dialogical consciousness cannot just happen passively. It essentially requires the awakening of this human consciousness through the very dialogical process itself. That's the wonderful challenge, that the dialogical cannot be told to anyone. No one can passively get it. It has to be a process in which one opens up one's being through the dialogical process, that the emergence of global ethics begins to become clear. So that our future is at risk. And it's a kind of risk that enterprising, future-oriented business persons, for example, are used to seeing and taking. And this is another exciting aspect in why leaders, visionary leaders in the business world who can see that our deepest survival as humans, as well as our positive responsibility to take charge of taking care of each other in the widest possible range, as well as the environment, is the question of our very sustainability and survival. So clearly everything is at risk. And it's in this spirit that we enter into these roundtables and leading to the dialogue in a committed long-range project. So the final remark then is that in entering into the dialogical, be prepared to question at the deepest level and to stand open in the presence of others and other views, and a willingness to engage and enter into these other views, because it's only going to deepen one's own self-understanding in the end, and this is the very process out of which global ethics emerges.